Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight's title is, as John said, Women of Easter Past, and it's going to be a chapter of oddments, really, selections from the narrative concerning Jesus' crucifixion, death, and resurrection from the perspective of the women who featured in those narratives. As you'll appreciate reading through the Gospels, women were there in the scenes, but very often they're not mentioned or they're not described. Few of them are named. But when it comes time for the story of Jesus' crucifixion, death and resurrection, they become very, very prominent. So we're at Jerusalem, somewhere near the Antonia fortress, in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. It is now mid-morning, about 9 o'clock on the day of preparation for the Jews' Passover. And Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea, has just now brought Jesus to the pavement in a final desperate attempt to persuade the Jewish leaders that Jesus ought to be released. But they have finally emphatically rejected Jesus and Pilate, saying, "We have no king but Caesar." Out of fear for his own career and his personal safety, Pilate finally yields to the Jewish leaders' demand to have Jesus crucified. Now, combining the Gospels, dovetailing them, as it were, Matthew 27 verse 31, Mark 15 verse 20, John 19 verses 16 through 17, we read this: "So Pilate then delivered Jesus to the Jews to be crucified, and after Pilate robe off him and put his own garments on him and led him out and away to crucify him. And Jesus went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha." If we resort to Luke's Gospel, we see Jesus walking with one end of the stake on his shoulder, and a man called Simon, who had just a short time ago been taken by the guards to help Jesus after he stumbled under his cross. So we see Jesus walking with one end of the stake on his shoulder, and Simon, presumably a young, strong Negro, bearing the other end of the stake behind him. We'll have a look at Luke chapter 23, and so that I don't have to keep my fingers in several Gospels at once, I'm reading from a version which dovetails the Gospel record. So we read at Luke 23, verses 27 through 32. "And there followed Jesus a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning up unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in the which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And there were also two others, malefactors, led with him to be put to death." Now, even though Jesus was physically almost exhausted, his mental and emotional faculties were still strong. His mental and emotional condition was still razor sharp. And as throughout his life and ministry, Jesus' sense of compassion and consideration for other people was as keen as ever. Luke illustrated this in his record of Jesus' comments to the women, and I imagine that Luke might have been able to record exhortations or words of comfort to Simon the Cyrene as well, and the two criminals, and even the Roman soldiers possibly. Jesus was so compassionate and considerate that even when the women of the city expressed grief and pity for Jesus, he turned the focus the other way, off himself and on to their future troubles. Appreciate that not all the women would necessarily have known Jesus particularly or known him well at all, but many of them had seen crucifixion victims and they knew what was in store for them, and they bewailed the terrible torture that was to come. Some of them were even, as it were, official wailers and mourners. But anyway, Jesus turned the focus off himself onto their future troubles, not because he wished to diminish or ignore the terrible thing that was happening to him, but to emphasize how very terrible and distressing would be the time of trouble that was to come upon Jerusalem within a generation or two. And if for some of the women, the wailing and beating of their breasts was just an act, Jesus was assuring them that eventually it would be for real. Jesus emphasized the difference between those two occasions by describing the present situation as the green, or we might say a sappy tree, a tree that was full of sap. He describes the future situation as the dry tree. The greenness or sappiness describes the spiritual life of the nation of Israel at the time that Jesus ministered. In particular, it referred to Jesus and his ministry. They were the spiritual life force that had coursed through the nation for the past 3 years. But because the nation was rejecting Jesus and would prove over the next several decades to reject the gospel ministry from the disciples of Christ as well, so the nation of Judea would become a dry tree, like the withered fig tree at Mark 11 verse 20. And then at that future time, the Romans would afflict the people of Jerusalem so terribly that the Jews' grief and anguish would be greater and even worse than what the women are now feeling for Jesus. The next paragraph is a small one of only 2 verses, each in Matthew's and Mark's Gospels. We'll have a read from Mark chapter 15, verse 22. And they bring Jesus unto the place Golgotha, which is being interpreted the place of a skull. Mark's word brought him to the place normally means to bear or carry. So it seems likely that even after Simon of Cyrene took much of the weight of the stake from Jesus, Jesus was nevertheless so exhausted that he could not continue walking unsupported and had to be held upright for the remainder of the walk to Golgotha. Possibly the soldiers did that, or they recruited other people to help Jesus. When I say recruited, they press-ganged people into helping him possibly. If Jesus really was this physically exhausted, then it makes his mental alertness and resilience all the more wonderful, especially in what follows. We read at verse 23, they gave him to drink wine mingled with myrrh, but he received it not. Jesus has not had anything to drink for at least 12 hours now, not since the Last Supper or possibly even before that. Ever since Gethsemane 7 hours ago, Jesus has been perspiring intensely from the stresses of his physical affliction, and now for at least the last hour, Jesus has been losing blood from his beatings and scourgings. So Jesus is now quite badly dehydrated and very thirsty, of course. Matthew 27 verse 34 shows us that Jesus wanted to drink and was possibly craving a drink, but as Matthew says, but after tasting the wine mingled with gall or myrrh, he was unwilling to drink it. Jesus was presumably hoping for water or vinegar perhaps, such as he will receive many hours later, as recorded in John 19 verse 30. The wine mingled with gall or myrrh, which is being offered to Jesus now, is offered repeatedly, and he refuses it each time. There are several possible reasons Jesus refused the drugged wine. Jesus had already said at the Last Supper that he would not drink the fruit of the vine again until the kingdom. If the drink was given as a pain relief, which most scholars accept that it was, and possibly by the same women that had been grieving after the crucifixion victims. So if the drink was given as a pain relief, Jesus would probably refuse it because he needed to be in full control of his faculties and thereby fully sensitive of the cup of suffering which God had given him to endure. By avoiding being desensitized both by the wine, the alcoholic wine, and by the drugs in it, the myrrh, for example, by avoiding being desensitized, Jesus is able to sympathize with us when we suffer the torture of pain and when we suffer the torture of thirst and headache. But more especially, Jesus was able to continue ministering during his time of suffering in whatever came up before him. Now, some commentators suggest that Jesus was being offered preferential treatment, which the two criminals were not offered. So it is possible Jesus refused the pain-killing drink out of consideration for them. The Jewish Talmud referred to a society of charitable Jewish women who made it their business to administer pain relief to crucifixion victims in Jerusalem and tried to help them until their deaths. Their motto was from Proverbs 31 verses 6 through 7, evidently. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his trouble no more. Even though the women's intentions were compassionate, Jesus could not identify himself with the lines of the proverb which suggest a man whose hope is lost. That is, the man whose life is bitter and who is impoverished and who wants to forget his troubles. Jesus would identify himself instead with the previous verses in Proverbs 31, which says, "It is not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to desire strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of the children of affliction." Jesus knew he was king, not the perishing man referred to in the proverb. The perishing man would drink the wine, but Jesus the king would not. Now there is a prophecy in Jeremiah which also may have come to Jesus' mind when he tasted the bitter flavour of the gall in the wine. Jeremiah 23 verse 15 denounces the false prophets. Thus says the Lord of hosts concerning the false prophets, "Behold, I will feed them with wormwood and make them drink water of gall. For from the prophets of Jerusalem has gone forth profaneness or ungodliness throughout the land." Now we know that the priests and Levites who wanted Jesus put to death were in the crowd, and we can well imagine that the desperate Jewish leaders might have tried to get Jesus to drink the potion just so they could proclaim that God's word in Jeremiah had proved that Jesus really was a false prophet, just as they had always claimed. But they would have been disappointed. Jesus' knowledge of the scriptures was so comprehensive and his mental faculties were still so sharp that as soon as he tasted the gall, he knew not to drink it. The next paragraph in the combined gospel record describes various aspects of the first few minutes of Jesus' crucifixion. And moving into Mark's gospel at chapter 15, verse 25, it says, "It was the 3rd hour and they crucified him." It was just one verse ago at Mark 15, verse 24, that we also read that they crucified him. So Mark seems to be saying the same thing twice. Actually, though, verse 24 is in the present continuous tense, which is best translated, "they were crucifying him," which describes a process. It wasn't just a singular event. It describes a whole process from firstly placing Jesus down on top of the stake, which is lying on the ground in the initial stages. It describes nailing each of his limbs to the stake in turn, which takes time. And then they have to physically or manually hoist the stake up off the ground. It is possible that they used machinery for that, but I could well imagine several of the strong guards having to do that manually. And then they set it upright in the post hole in the ground. And this whole process took several minutes. They were, during which time they were also dividing his garments. They were nailing down the inscription Pilate had written. They were listening to the argument between Pilate and the high priests. They might have been listening to Jesus' prayers. They might also have helped restrain the other two victims. And now, finally, as Mark 15 verse 25 says, it was the third hour when they had crucified him. And this is now approximately 9 o'clock in the morning. Jesus is now hanging from the upright stake. And if Jesus was nailed in the position I described earlier, then his body is now slumped slightly forward of the stake with his arms stretched out full length overhead. His body weight is pulling painfully on his arms, shoulders and chest. His legs are now bent with his knees forward. From side on, Jesus looks as if he is caught halfway through kneeling down with his arms reaching up and behind. He almost looks as if he's in a posture of prayer, kneeling with his arms raised. He will stay in that position for about 6 hours, which is a mercifully short time for a typical crucifixion victim. Secular history tells us that victims were normally hung not far off the ground so that dogs and other carnivorous animals could easily reach their legs and buttocks and abdomen. The victims' upper bodies were food for rats and birds in the later stages. Happily, this was not to be Jesus' fate. And we can tell from Mark 15 verse 36 that Jesus is hanging with his face at least 8 feet above the ground, and I would suggest rather higher, because when some people offered him a sponge with vinegar in it, they had to put the sponge on a reed to reach his mouth. So he was evidently a fair way above the ground. Raised up beside Jesus to his left and right are the other two victims whom Luke's Gospel describes as criminals and whom Matthew and Mark's Gospels describe as bandits or robbers. And it is at this point that, as Matthew 27 verse 36 says, that the soldiers sat down and began to keep watch over Jesus at that place. It was only when Jesus was lifted up on the stake and had come to rest, at least with his head 2 feet over the heads of the crowd, that he was then able to see everybody who was gathered around in front of him. It would be like somebody being hoisted up on a fair-sized ladder and being able to see over the crowd. So we read now at John chapter 19, verses 25 through 27. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his own mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and also there was Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, Woman, behold your son. And then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home. This is one of the very few passages that indicate that any of Jesus' disciples were present at his crucifixion. And if we accept that this disciple whom Jesus loved is the Apostle John himself, then he is the only apostle who is known to have been present according to the gospel record. However, in 1 Peter 5 verse 1, Peter refers to himself as a witness of the sufferings of Christ, which would be one reason for the details recorded in Mark's Gospel, because Mark is believed to have been written for Peter. I'm also inclined to believe that Matthew's Gospel is also an eyewitness account. And Luke's Gospel records at chapter 23 verse 49 that all Jesus' acquaintances and the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance seeing these things. Luke, in that verse, is referring to a time much later in the day, from John 19, verse 25, when Jesus has just been erected on the cross. This Luke's reference is six hours after Jesus was first crucified. It would seem then that even though the apostles had mostly forsaken Jesus since they were at the Garden of Gethsemane, they did all eventually emerge from hiding and gather with the other multitudes at Golgotha. We can only imagine how wretched they must have felt as they beheld Jesus on the cross. Wretched not only because of horror or grief at Jesus' suffering, but also especially because of regret and guilt at having abandoned him. While these acquaintances, including the women, stood at a distance, Jesus' own mother came close enough that he could make eye contact with her and speak to her. I don't imagine that she was at a great distance. I imagine that she was comparatively close by this time. The other women mentioned by John probably would not have gone so close to the cross if not for Jesus' mother Mary herself. I say this because we know that after Mary was taken away, the others chose to remain, but only at a distance. Right now, they're only close to the cross because they're keeping up with Mary, trying to care for her and comfort her and possibly forcefully take her away from the scene. But there they are, trying to be with her as she presses through the crowd, as anguished and distraught and stricken as only a mother could be for her dying child. Right now, a prophecy is being fulfilled which was spoken to Mary over 3 decades ago when Jesus was less than 2 months old. Luke chapter 2 verse 35 recorded the prophet Simeon saying to Mary that because of her son, a sword will pierce even your own soul. And we can be sure that right now Mary felt the piercing pain just as surely as Jesus did. And I believe that if she could, she would have willingly taken Jesus' place on the cross to save him from the suffering. This will be the last we read of Mary until she is referred to briefly in Acts chapter 1 verse 14, where she is seen in the company of the apostles and other disciples. Now, even though there is pain and horror and grief in this crucifixion scene, both for Jesus and for Mary, his mother, it is actually a wonderfully uplifting passage because it records the putting to right of the bad relationship that had existed for quite some time between Jesus and Mary. Prior to this passage, the last reference to Mary, recorded in Matthew 12 verse 46, also Mark 3 verse 31 and Luke 8 verse 19, showed Mary standing apart from Jesus at a distance. She stood outside the crowd of disciples and she was wanting Jesus to come away from his ministry. She and her other sons had sent messengers through the crowd asking Jesus to come away from what he was doing and to be with them. They thought he had gone mad. Jesus' reply was a rebuke to his own mother. He said, "Who is my mother?" He told the crowd that it was those close to him that were really like his mother and brothers and sisters. Now, though, in John at the crucifixion scene, the picture is reversed and Mary is shown here moving toward Jesus, pressing through the crowd to be close to him in the time of his greatest physical suffering. Now she wants to be where he is, more so, I believe, than anyone else there. And Jesus' reply to her was words of reconciliation. "Woman, behold your son." In Jesus' estimation, the bond of affection with Mary is restored. The past estrangement and offence is over. Somehow, in the way that only Jesus can, he must have spoken to Mary with such a voice and with such a look on his face that she would be fully assured and comforted that she and he were no longer at enmity with each other. Jesus' other parting gift to Mary was to get her away from Golgotha and to ensure that she would have all the care and support she needed through this harrowing time of Jesus' absence. The care and support she needed was not just natural but spiritual. Mary's other natural sons could not supply the spiritual needs because their attitude toward Jesus was negative. The disciple whom Jesus loved was the perfect choice because of all the male disciples, including the other apostles, he was the one who remained closest to both Mary and Jesus during their time of greatest suffering and trial. By telling the disciple whom he loved to "Behold your mother," Jesus was as good as calling that disciple his own brother. He was one of what would eventually be many spiritual brothers, and though that disciple did not know it at that very moment, Jesus was alluding to a new relationship that he was ushering in for all his disciples, a new creation, a new family of Christ's brethren. The point arrives when all four Gospels converge on the final events which all took place within perhaps just 20 seconds of Jesus' crucifixion before his death. Jesus has wet his lips with the vinegar that was offered to him on the reed, so his lips and throat are wetted, and he commenced with reciting the Psalm 22 while his Jewish and Roman audience watch and listen. From a long way away comes the rumbling of an earthquake. And now, if we merge all the four Gospels together, we read something like this. And the veil of the temple was torn in the middle, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, "It is finished." And after having cried out with a loud voice, he uttered a loud cry, saying, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he bowed his head, breathed his last breath, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth was shaken, and the rocks were split, and the tombs were opened. Now if we read from Luke chapter 23, after the death of Jesus, Luke 23 from verse 48 to 49, "And all the people that came together to that sight, beholding the things which were done, smote their breasts and returned. And all his acquaintance, as we've read before, and the women that followed him from Galilee, stood afar off, beholding these things." Now, Matthew 27, verses 55 through 56, and Mark 15, verses 40 through 41, specifically mention three women. They were Mary Magdalene, Salome, the mother of Zebedee's sons, who were the apostles James and John, and another Mary, who was the mother of the other apostle James and of his brother Joseph. Appropriately, Jesus' own mother Mary is not mentioned at this stage because, as we know from John 19 verse 27, she was taken away from Golgotha. So there is sort of an internal consistency or harmony between the several gospel records. Mark adds that many other women were there who had come with Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem. The Apostle John, who had taken Mary away from Golgotha, has probably been back since shortly before Jesus' death. His testimony, recorded from John 19 verses 31 through to verse 37, indicates that he was one of the very few who would remain close to Golgotha over the following hour or so. His testimony is one part of the evidence that Jesus was truly dead while he was on the cross, a fact which many skeptics try to assert was not true, but which John's Gospel assures us that he was, due to the fact that when the soldiers came to the three crucifixion victims to break their legs, they saw with their experienced eye that Jesus was already dead by his appearance. To just check, one soldier pierced Jesus in the side, and evidently punctured his lung and his heart, and out came water and blood, indicating that the blood had actually separated after Jesus' heart had stopped some time earlier. It had separated into the blood plasma and into the blood platelets. That's what John was referring to by the water and the blood, the red and the clear liquid. A little later on, at Luke 23, verses 54 through 55, it tells us, "And it was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin," or the Sabbath was about to dawn, which is to say sunset. "Now the women who had come with Jesus out of Galilee followed after and saw the tomb and saw how his body was laid." Because, of course, as you know, both Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus the Pharisee had gone to great effort to procure the body from Pontius Pilate and to prepare Jesus' body for burial with different herbs, different spices, I should say, and to wrap him before putting him into Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And so Luke 23 from verse 54 to 55 is saying that the women beheld how that had been done. Matthew and Mark refer particularly to Mary Magdalene, who was there, and the other Mary, Mary the mother of Joseph, who I take to be Mary the wife of Cleopas of John 19 verse 25, both sitting opposite the grave, who were looking on to see where Jesus was laid. Now, quite appropriately, Matthew and Mark make no reference to Jesus' own mother being there once again, which is understandable because, as we've seen, John's Gospel already mentioned that Jesus' mother Mary had been taken away from Golgotha many hours earlier, long before Jesus died. So here is another little undesigned harmony of the Gospels. It does contradict popular tradition. Generally speaking, if ever the story of the crucifixion is depicted in films, Mary is there right till Jesus' death, and evidently that simply was not the case. It demonstrates, though, the Gospel record's historical authenticity because of that internal consistency and harmony. Mary's absence also provides the probable solution to a question often raised by Bible commentaries and dictionaries, which is, why is Martha nowhere to be found at this part of the Gospel record? We know that Jesus loved Martha and Martha loved Jesus, but what we know of Martha's practical character suggests that right now she is serving and comforting Jesus' mother Mary, somewhere far removed from the scene of her son's death and burial. There is still apparently something like half an hour left before sunset and the beginning of the Sabbath, so the time is somewhere from 5:30 to 6 p.m. The two women at Golgotha might have sat until it grew dark, just mourning the death of Jesus and feeling desolate and hopeless. Instead of that, their emotional stress drove them to do something practical as a final act of love and homage to their dead Lord. Luke 23 verse 56 tells us that these two Marys returned and prepared spices and perfumes. We might wonder why they decided to do this even after seeing Joseph and Nicodemus had already embalmed Jesus with about 30 kilograms of myrrh and aloes. My guess is that the women had spoken to Joseph, or had at least presumed that he would return to Jesus' body as soon as possible and make up for what must have been a very hasty embalming. Apparently it was traditional to not only apply the spices to the corpse and to the linen bandaging, but also where possible to coat the recess in the tomb floor where the body was laid. In this way the whole mummified corpse might be immersed virtually in a bath of resinous spices. This would normally only be done for very wealthy Jews or for royalty, but of course the two women loved Jesus exceedingly, as did many other of the women, so nothing was too much to give him, even a burial fit for a king. Apparently, the Jewish Rabbi Gamaliel II, who was the grandson of Rabbi Gamaliel referred to in Acts 5 verse 34, he was embalmed with even more spices than Jesus was. Obviously, the Jews of his day wanted to show their respect and adoration of their great rabbi by a lavish embalming. So it need be no surprise that Jesus' disciples should wish to do the same for him, especially among the women. Finally, the sun set, and the Sabbath, which this year was the day of the Passover meal, it commenced, and as we read, on the Sabbath day the women rested according to the commandment. Time has passed, and we come now to the final hour of that Sabbath day, which Matthew 21 verse 1 refers to. Now late on Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. Now I know that most people read this as if it referred to sunrise on the morning of the resurrection, but in fact that is not what this is referring to. It refers to 12 hours early at about sunset near the end of the Sabbath, Saturday evening, in other words. This is because the word dawning in this verse, just as in Luke 23 verse 54, it refers not to sunrise, but to the emergence or the appearing of the new day. In other words, the dawning or the beginning of the day which follows the Sabbath. And as you appreciate in the biblical Jewish tradition, every new day begins at sunset, not at sunrise, which at this time of year was at about 6 p.m. So Matthew 28 verse 1 is simply telling us that shortly before sunset, as the Sabbath was nearly ended and the first day of the week was arriving, the two Marys who had viewed the burial of Jesus from a distance the day before now came to the tomb to inspect it more closely. The probable reason for this is simply so they could have a clear idea of how the tombstone was set in place and how easy or difficult it would be to move the stone to gain entrance into the tomb. If we assume that the apostles were all in hiding at this stage, as they seem to have been, the women appear as if they are working among themselves by themselves, and so they're very reliant on each other to help with this great mission of trying to get into the tomb to give the embalming to Jesus' body. So we can make these simple inferences by considering Mark 16 verses 1 through 3 and Luke 24 verse 1, which tell us that several of the women were arranging to anoint Jesus' body again, in addition to the embalming that Joseph and Nicodemus had already done. Now, the Mark and Luke passages I've just referred to make it obvious that the women never saw the tomb being sealed or guarded by soldiers when they inspected it this Saturday evening, and for this reason we can deduce that the guard will be set up later in the evening when it's darker, sometime after the two Marys have left the tomb and gone back to the city. So now the two Marys have inspected the tomb and the stone and are obviously satisfied that they can carry out their plan the following morning. The sun has now set, and we next read at Mark 16 verse 1 that when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James, she's also the mother of Joseph, and Salome, she's the mother of the apostles, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. So these three women bought spices, which is to say they went out to buy them so that they might come and anoint him. These women know that Jesus has already been embalmed and anointed before by Joseph and Nicodemus before they buried him, 30 kilograms of spices. The two Marys had already prepared more spices before the Sabbath started, and now they and Salome have just bought even more spices. So we can only imagine the total amount of spices and perfumes that the women wished to bestow upon Jesus' body, probably something like 50 kilograms. But it is obviously such a large amount that it probably exceeds that which would later be bestowed on Rabbi Gamaliel II. Clearly the women want to honour their dead Lord Jesus with a burial that is truly fit for a king. I imagine that for the most part the spices were bought in a comparatively raw state, so we can imagine the three women and possibly many other women with them having to spend the evening in processing and refining the spices so that they can be used for the anointing. Theirs, of course, is a labour of deep love for Jesus, and it possibly kept them busy right through the night. That night, the Jewish leaders also laboured due to their unwavering hatred of Jesus. Matthew 27 verse 66 tells us that after Pilate dismissed them, they, the Jewish leaders, went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. It is suggested that at Matthew 28 verse 1, when the two Marys visited the tomb at sunset, this was actually before the Jewish leaders set a seal on the tombstone and left the guards there later that evening. Now, if that suggestion is correct, which seems to be the only alternative, then between Matthew 28 verses 1 and 2, there is a time gap of several hours. Maybe if I had been writing the authorised version, I might have created a chapter division between verse 1 and 2 to make that more clear. But that's how it appears to be, a time gap of several hours, which I believe brings us to the following morning, quite early, probably an hour or two before sunset, or before sunrise, probably an hour or two before sunrise. And because we've had such clear mornings over the last few days since Easter, we get some concept of how very dark it can be just a matter of half an hour before twilight happens, and then maybe half an hour later again before the sun starts to appear, depending, of course, on the lie of the land. But we read now at Matthew 28, verses 2 through till 4. Behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment was white as snow. And because of their fear of him, the keepers, that is the guards, did shake and became as dead men. So in the early morning of this first day of the week, there is what is called in the Greek a mega earthquake, presumably something very like the one that struck Taiwan just a couple of days ago. It was a mega earthquake that rocks Jerusalem and presumably much of central Judea, and who knows, maybe it was an earthquake that was felt around the world. At the crucifixion, a great earthquake signalled the death of Jesus and the defeat of sin in the flesh. We're probably right to assume that this latest earthquake signalled the revival of Jesus and his victory over death. Both events, Jesus' death and his resurrection, shook the natural order to its very foundations. Matthew says the earthquake happened for or because an angel came from heaven to the site of Jesus' tomb. The angel was, of course, a divine messenger come to earth with a divine message, a witness of Jesus' resurrection. The angel might have been sent to Jesus first, and just as Jesus had told his ministers at the tomb of Lazarus, remove the stone and then unbind him and let him go, so maybe this angelic minister of God was given the same instructions regarding Jesus. So not only did the angel move the stone, but possibly also released Jesus from the shackles of death by breathing into him the breath of life. If this was the same angel who ministered to Jesus during his agony at Gethsemane, then what a blessing for the angel to be by Jesus at his victory and to give him praise and worship. After the resurrection, the removal of the stone and the earthquake and the angel's appearance to soldiers and disciples, all were different ways of proclaiming the message of Jesus' resurrection. The fact that the angel literally and visibly rolled the stone and sat upon it in full view of the guards was a witness to them that this creature was supernatural, not only with superhuman strength, but also evidently the ability to levitate or to fly. The angel's action was also a reply or a rebuff to the Jewish leaders. They wanted the tomb firmly closed, but the angel wanted it firmly opened. The angel sitting on the stone was in effect challenging the guards to undo what he had done. The guards were not stupid though. They were terrified and promptly fainted all around the tomb entrance, possibly for many minutes. Matthew makes the point that it was not the earthquake that frightened the guards, even though it was bad enough. However scary the earthquake must have been, the angel was even more terrifying to these Roman guards. Since Passover, the full moon has begun to wane, but it is still very bright in the night sky. In the natural course of the lunar cycle, the moon will not set until after sunrise. So we can be certain that even very early on this resurrection morning, there is still ample bright moonlight by which to see easily. Another thing we can be certain of is that the earthquake would have disturbed people all around Jerusalem and presumably woken everybody up. I believe that among those that have been disturbed are Mary Magdalene and another woman, possibly her sister Martha or the other Mary, or Salome, the mother of James and John, woken or disturbed by the earthquake if they were already awake and are unable to sleep. Mary Magdalene and at least one other woman get up early that morning and head for Jesus' tomb. So we read now from John chapter 20, verses 1 through 2. The first day of the week comes Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and sees the stone taken away from the sepulchre. Then she runs and comes to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and says to them, They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him. So Mary and her friend have viewed the tomb under moonlight. They have clearly seen the tombstone has been moved right away from the entrance, and they have seen several of the Roman soldiers, probably sprawled on the ground as if they had been attacked, or possibly one or two wandering around. From a distance, the women cannot tell what has happened, but it looks to them as if the tomb has been violated and plundered. And so the women, both upset and agitated, obviously shocked at seeing what they would never have expected, they run to tell Peter and John what they think they have seen. And so even at this stage, we can see how prominent several of these women, who are only really alluded to through the earlier parts of the Gospels, how prominent these women are becoming on this occasion of Jesus' resurrection. I'll stop at that point. There's still a fair bit to discuss, and maybe, God willing, I'll share that at a later date.